Hey, Pioneers! Welcome to episode number 432. We are going to be going back to our Homesteading 101 Basics series. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about preserving. So a lot of times when we think about preserving food, I know a lot of people's minds go immediately to canning, which I love, and then usually dehydrating, maybe freeze drying, and it kind of goes down the line from there. However, there are multiple ways to preserve food at home. In fact, I've got them numbered out, and there are 9 to 10 main ways, depending on how you want to classify those. If you want to take canning as one or break that down into water bath versus pressure canning, water bath canning being one, pressure canning being two method, right? So a little bit there in the numbers. But the point is, there are a lot of ways to preserve food at home. So before we dive more into nuances and how-tos and things you need to know about each one of these preservation methods, which I do have on quite a few of them, both videos and podcast episodes that go into much greater detail. So we will link to those in today's show notes, as well as the blog post that accompanies this episode on the ones that already exist. So if you want to dive into those and find out about them in further detail, you can do so. To access that, you can go to melissaknorris.com/number 432, because this is episode number 432. But at the time of this recording, it is kind of the beginning of the main preservation series, or season, I should say, as well as series that we'll be doing. But the main part of the preservation season, I will get that word out, is just beginning. So if you are in the South, you may have a few more vegetables, or a warmer area of the country, you may have a few more fruits and vegetables coming on a bit sooner than those of us who are in the North. But it's pretty interesting because most of us kind of converge, and during the summer months into fall, have really close to the same things coming on and being in season, and just a large flush of fresh produce available to us, either from our own gardens or from local farmers markets, CSAs, etc. So having a good basis on all of the ways that you can preserve food is fabulous. And then this also gives you time, because we're at the beginning of the season, to perhaps learn some of these methods, get invested into some equipment. And we'll go through a little bit of that today on what type of equipment you'll need for each one. And also, if you are listening to this when it goes live, I am going to be doing a free training on June 10th. That's Monday, June 10th. And we'll have a link where you can go and get yourself signed up for that. It's free, and it's a live class. We're going to be diving deeper into food preservation and using all of these different ways. So today's episode, we're going to be focusing on just kind of a highlight, and I'll be sharing which of these methods I prefer for which types of food in preservation and building out our pantries and our skill sets. Now, if you are brand new to food preservation, I usually recommend, in anything, be it gardening, livestock, all the different things that we can go down in homesteading, that you layer on your skills and not try to do too much at once. Otherwise, we end up burning ourselves out. And it's a bit hard to master a skill if you're trying to do and learn 10 different skills at once, right? So giving yourself to kind of some time to dig in deep and to really get a good understanding and basic and feel confident in a method and a skill set, and then layer on the next one. And sometimes there's, that can be multifaceted, and you may be layering a few things on at a time, but it's the long haul of the journey that we're after. And so I have found, truly, by focusing on a few things at once, getting confident in them, and then bringing on the next thing, that allows you to not become overwhelmed or not go into burnout, so that you can carry it on for the long haul. So the first one that we're going to start with is going to be freezing, because most folks have if you don't have a deep freezer, at least you have the freezer of your fridge, right? Combination. And a lot of folks do have a deep freezer. So we're going to talk about this because it's just probably one of the most accessible ways to preserve food. So obviously, using a freezer allows food to keep for many months, sometimes a year, if properly packaged. And I'll show what we use our deep freezer for, because I do use a lot of other forms of the food preservation, but we do still use our deep freezer. I like to use our deep freezer for our meat specifically. We raise almost all of our own protein sources. So we raise our own grass-fed, grass-finished beef cattle, which means when we're butchering, we're getting anywhere from a quarter to a half a cow at a time. When we're doing our pigs, I'm a whole pig at a time. And then we do our own meat birds, and I prefer to raise meat birds during the summer months. We butcher right as we're moving into fall. And so that means depending on how many I have left in the freezer and how many we've raised and butchered, usually about 25 to 30 birds are going into the deep freezer at once. Now, can I freeze dry those cuts? Can I pressure can those? Absolutely. However, and I do some of that, but there's certain things like I like to be able to roast a whole chicken. I cannot can or freeze dry a whole chicken. I am not interested in pressure canning my steaks. Like when a ribeye, I want that baby grilled. I don't want it pulling it out of the jar fully cooked, though I do pressure can stew meat and other cuts of meat and like having those on hand. But my point being, as well as with the pork, when you come to cured meats, you should not be canning cured meats because of the nitrates. So there's even safety there with pressure canning on certain things. So I like to have the deep freezer for the items that I don't are a safety candidate for using some of these other forms. Or, as I said, I want to eat my steak as a steak. I don't want to have that canned and cubed and pre-cooked like you would do with pressure canning your meat. I also use our deep freezer for certain fruits and vegetables that aren't candidates, obviously safely for canning, or I don't want in the canned format. I really do like to keep some of our blueberries. Now, I dehydrate blueberries, I freeze dry blueberries, I make blueberry syrup and blueberry jam. But then with the other parts of our blueberry harvest, I do like to keep some just frozen in the deep freezer for making smoothies. I prefer a frozen blueberry. I use it as an ice cube so that it helps with the texture of the smoothies when we're making them. I just like to have frozen blueberries. So I like to use the deep freezer for that. But because we use the other forms of food preservation, that allows me to have the space in the deep freezer for the things that I'm not using the other modes to preserve. Now, aside from meat and fruits and vegetables, of course, the deep freezer can be used for a lot of other foods that people might not typically think of using. So I freeze butter. You cannot safely pressure can butter, nor can you freeze dry whole things of fat. So like just chunks of butter, you can't freeze dry those. So I use our deep freezer to freeze our cubes of butter. It thaws great, doesn't do anything different to the texture. It will allow it to store for a long period of time. So we use that. Milk. Now you can freeze dry milk, but I know not everybody has a freeze dryer. So you can use milk and freeze dry dairy products really fine. Cheese is another one that works great, and even eggs. Now I have to say, I do have a freeze dryer, so I do prefer to freeze dry my eggs now, and I do freeze dry my milk products, but the freezer is a great alternative to that if you don't have a freeze dryer for those. And I do have videos tutorial-wise that walk you through some of those different items and how to do that and how to use the deep freezer, especially for things like eggs. I also will use the freezer to buy myself some time in order to then can those items later. So I will use the deep freezer when the tomatoes are coming on and some of our fruits and berries when I've got everything coming on from the garden at once. I'll throw those in the freezer, knowing that some of those berries I'm going to be turning into jam and or syrup. And once they are frozen and then thawed, of course, they release their liquid a lot better. So for tomatoes to make tomato sauce, and for berries to do jams, jellies, fruit syrups, etc., it actually is great because it makes it easier to take those frozen then thawed items and turn them into what I'm already planning on creating with them later when I've got space, which tends to be more in the fall, first part of winter months. Now, I also use our freezer for, sometimes it's for bread, the dough, like the unbaked, like I will do a bunch of cookie dough, biscuit dough, those types of things, usually non-leavened, where they don't need to rise. There's no yeast. And then I will bake those from a frozen state. That works great for really busy days, but I also will use it after I have baked bread. I will bake a couple extra loaves and then I'll freeze that and or like dinner rolls, anything like that. I found with products that have yeast in them, either sourdough, the wild yeast, or store-bought yeast that are leavened product that need to have rise time, I prefer to bake them and then freeze them from their baked state versus the raw dough and non-leavened things. I just feel like texture-wise and all of those things, that's how I get the best performance from them, is in that manner. So I will also use my freezer for those types of items. Now, obviously the drawback to the freezer, and that's kind of where I want to talk about some of your pros and cons, right, of each one of these methods, is cost to operate. Obviously, it requires power. We have a generator. We run out of power enough. We live very, very rurally. I went without power for 2 weeks at a time. It's pretty common for us to lose power for days on end. So we have a generator. So I've got that backup for when the power goes out because I don't want to lose all of my meat and products in there. If it was for an extended period, like where I couldn't get gas or fuel for whatever reason for my generator, and I would be in danger of losing that food, then obviously what could be pressure canned or what could be dehydrating or what could be used in other formats, then I would go ahead and do that. But I have never, thankfully, been in the scenario where that was actually a case that I needed to do that. But you do need to have a backup plan if you've got a significant amount of food in your deep freezer. If the power does go out, how are you going to take care of that? So my backup plan is our generator. Then I've got the further backup plan, like, okay, this would get pressure can, this would do that, like XYZ. Now, next on the list, I actually debated, like, is it number 2 or is it number 3? So 2 and 3 are kind of a tie. I'm going to go with the cold storage and or root cellar next. Now, I'm prefacing this with saying you do not have to have a basement or a true root cellar or anything like that in order to use these techniques. I live in a manufactured home, modular, which is a fancy way of saying a double wide. And we in our double wide with no basement, right? And not using a crawl space, anything like that, unheated garage, etc. I don't even have a garage. We are able to keep these crops using root cellar type techniques in the kitchen and then in a closet area until we built on. But for over a decade, I just used a coat closet for a lot of these things. And now we actually were able to build on a small room addition on the end of our house because the closet was running out of space. We put up so much food that I needed that extra space for. So about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which in full disclosure, our room that I use for our root cellar techniques never is that cold. 2, ideally not really above 75 degrees Fahrenheit, or at least not for extended period of time. So like the truly ideal temperature is going to be from about 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit to about 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, ours, I do this successfully with some of this in our kitchen. And then, as I said, another room that was a closet. So those temperature ranges there, because it's in part of our house that is heated, is usually from 60 degrees Fahrenheit to about 75, maybe 80 a few days out of the summer months. Typically, the interior of our house doesn't get that hot during summer and stay that way for long. So when we're talking about root cellaring and cold storage varieties that don't require dampness and humidity, that is going to be things like onions, garlic, winter squash, dried shelled beans. Those all do fabulous. Now, variety does matter. Storage varieties matter on those crops. And we will link to, I've got a post as well as the free live class that I'm going to be doing on June 10th, but I've also got some posts that we can link out to those where I share the varieties for storage varieties, as well as making sure that they have been cured properly. If those steps are taken on onions, garlic, and winter squash, they will last for months, sometimes up to 9 months to a year. I've actually had garlic that has went for 18 months, only using those strategies and keeping them basically at room temperature. Can work really, really well. This is probably actually my favorite way to store food because it requires the least amount of work on my part. I'm really not doing anything, and this food stays just at shelf stable, right? I'm not having, freezer electricity, anything like that in order to store it. And I love that. Now, root cellaring techniques for things that require a little bit cooler temperatures and humidity so that they don't shrivel up. That is a biggie. And that's going to be more for things like beets, parsnips, cabbage, potatoes, carrots, and apples. So if you do have an area that stays a little bit cooler, that's going to be where you're going to want to be more like in the 35 to about 45, 50 degrees max range and have significant humidity so that they don't shrivel up. Then you can store for months and months and months potatoes, carrots, beets, parsnips, cabbage, and apples. One of the caveats, though, is light, especially with potatoes, more so than the others even. Light is going to cause them to sprout. It is temperature, but it also is light is in there. So in the closet scenario that I shared with you, and then the room that we built, there is no exterior windows. So no exterior light is coming on. There's a light bulb. Obviously, don't leave the light bulb on all the time. But I have found humidity to be the biggest factor with those crops. So for us, I have an entire video for those of you watching this on YouTube. If you're listening to this the old-fashioned way, again, in the blog post that accompanies today's episode, we will link to that. I leave them in the ground. Now you can do crates with sand, damp sand. There's different things that you can do to increase the humidity in order to store those. But we have found by leaving them in the ground and doing really heavy mulching, that has been the best thing for us when it comes to carrots and potatoes specifically. And I go further into detail in those, so I don't want to spend too much time here, but that one is really, really awesome, provided you have cured crops that need to be cured, and taken some of those steps, including variety, in order to successfully use these techniques. But they can work really well even in just a regular kitchen scenario. Okay. Number 3 is dehydrating. So dehydrating is great because it takes very little storage space. It's lightweight, so you don't have to worry about having, shelving units, things that can support weight, and they're easy to pack, right? For backpackers, kids, things when you're on the go, it's really easy to grab dehydrated food and take it with you as a portable food source. So that's really nice. It's also shelf stable. So once it's dehydrated, of course, we don't need anything else. It's good to go on the shelf until time of consumption. And some of them, like dried fruit, are actually eaten in the dehydrated state. They don't even don't even need water in order to rehydrate them in order to consume them. So that's also great. Now, some things such as dehydrated vegetables like carrots, zucchini noodles, those are things that we dehydrate. Those are going to be rehydrated. Most people aren't going to want to eat those in their dehydrated state as is, and then used for cooking. All vegetables, fruits, and herbs are candidates for dehydrating. And you can dehydrate some forms of meat and eggs. Usually with dehydrating needs to be cooked, not done in its raw form. And there's still some caveats on like home dehydrated jerky, etc., for long-term storage that will require the fridge. There's different nuances there. And so we won't dive into all of that because that would be a full episode on dehydrating alone. But again, I've got posts that walk you through some different tutorials and doing dehydrated items that we'll link to in today's post. But one of the great things about dehydrating is, depending on what you're dehydrating, especially if it's herbs or leafy greens, is you don't even have to have a dehydrator in order to dehydrate those items. You can dehydrate them at room temperature. Some people will use an oven. If your oven will go down on lower settings, then you can prop the door open depending on how low your oven will go. But almost all of our leafy herbs and flowers, those types of things, and I'm talking herbal flowers to consume, like chamomile flowers, blossoms, calendula, etc., I will dehydrate those. And you can use, if you have an electric dehydrator, that's fabulous because you can set them at like 95 degrees Fahrenheit if you're trying to keep medicinal properties in your herbs. It's not just for culinary use, which is what my preference is. So I will use that for some of the bigger things that might be taking a little bit longer to dehydrate. But for most of my things like basil leaves, stinging nettle, anything that's really the leafy part, I hang dry those. And so you don't have to have any other equipment in order to do that. And then it's shelf stable, which is some of my favorites. Okay. Up next is going to be our water bath and or steam canning. So I love the water bath and or the steam canner. And full disclosure, I use my steam canner now in place of my water bath canner, which is completely safe. Steam canners have been approved for acidic recipes, so water bath canning recipes, for a number of years now. The reason I love it, I've got tutorials, you can go and see that bad boy in action, is because it uses less water. So it's not as heavy. It heats up faster because it's using less water, so it doesn't take as long, so less energy consumption, and it's faster for me because less water is being heated, so I can process things faster due to that heat up time instead of using the big water bath. But I share this because you can technically water bath can without purchasing a water bath canner. You have to have a pot that is large enough once the jar of canned food is submerged in the pot, when you're water bath canning, the layer of water above the submerged sealed jar needs to be 1 to 2 inches. And then you also need to have some type of a rack because you don't ever want the bottom of your canning jar sitting right directly on the heat source. So that's why water bath canners come with a rack. However, if you have a large pot at home that has a lid, then you can make your own rack on the bottom by twisting up dish towels and putting it in the bottom. Or I will even take the canning bands. This one's already canned, so I have a band on there, and I'll put that in the bottom of a pot. And then you can put your jars right on that, and it makes a canning rack, which is the bands, which you do have to can. So our water bath and or steam canner is used for acidic foods that are 4.6 pH or lower. The lower the pH number, the more acidic it is. You can safely water bath acidic foods because botulism does not grow in acidic environments, specifically of 4.6 pH or lower. So that is why we can safely can via water bath, boiling water, acidic fruits, which is most fruits of jams, jellies, syrups, fruit syrups, pickling. We're using the vinegar to get that acidity because vegetables are not acidic on their own. It's a great entry point for home canners because all you need to have are your canning jars, lids, and band, and that large pot. Home canned fruit, I feel, is better than store-bought because you can adjust the amount of sugar, including no sugar. Sugar, when it comes to canning, is not actually part of the safety process. It is acidity, not sugar, that is keeping those home canned foods safe. So you can food at home without sugar, being completely sugar-free. And there's some, I've got lots of different tutorials on that and recipes on how to do that, etc. So as I said, we've got foods that can safely be water bath canned are most fruits and jams. When it comes to fruits, most your stone fruits and your berries, with the exception of white peaches. White peaches are not acidic enough to can at home. And then bananas and a lot of your melons are not acidic enough to can at home. So that's why you shouldn't be canning things like banana butter. There's a few recipes that are from tested sources that have a small amount of banana with strawberry. So if it's like an extension office, National Center of Home Food Preservation, a ball-tested recipe, etc., that you'll see bananas there, that's fine. But if you see anybody advocating for canning straight bananas, because of the acidity level and the density issue of mushy bananas together, that one is not a safe candidate for canning. Now, to be done properly, as I said, tomatoes and salsas. However, and I've got recipes for this for you and tutorials, tomatoes to be done safely, tomato sauce, including salsas, have to have added acid, or just if you're canning straight stewed tomatoes, because tomatoes are already borderline not being acidic enough. And so that's why we're adding an added source to that, because again, it's that 4.6 pH level. Now, depending on the ripeness of the tomato, the soil that it's growing, there's like a lot of factors there. And so that's why we add our added acid to our tomato products, and then they are fine for us to water bath can and or use a steam canner. So next up on our canning list is, of course, going to be pressure canning. So technically, I have pressure canning as a separate item, so it's going to be number 5 on our list. Pressure canning is the only safe way to can non-acidic food. So this is going to be non-pickled vegetables, not all vegetables, mind you, meats, soups, combination recipes, etc. A pressure canner allows the jars to reach a higher temperature than just boiling water. So boiling water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you boil boiling water for 3 hours or 10 minutes, once it's reached the point of boiling, right, it still doesn't get above 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And botulism, if it's in a non-acidic environment, botulism spores, in order for them to be killed, have to get heated above the temperature of boiling water. So at 10 pounds of pressure in a pressure canner, that temperature that you're going to reach inside is 248 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's crucial to ensuring that the botulism spores are killed. So when done correctly, pressure canning is a very safe way to preserve food at home. The advantage of pressure canning is the greater ability of different foods that you can safely can, right? As I said, meat, broth, your vegetables, etc., can all be done that way. Not all vegetables, however, can safely be pressure canned, nor all cuts of meat. Most cuts of meat, as I said earlier, nitrates are something that we have to be careful with when canning. Should not be canning straight things of nitrates. And then Certain vegetables like broccoli, cauliflower, summer squash should not be canned straight, meaning a jar of broccoli. Pickling recipes, you'll see cauliflower pickled, you'll see cabbage pickled, but we don't have, for a variety of reasons, sometimes there is no safety timing tested done on that. It can become too mushy. It's not a good end product. Sometimes it's safety because of mushiness and density, as in the case of zucchini summer squash. Now, as again, you'll see summer squash zucchini in pickling recipes like relishes or as pickles, but that's different than them being canned as just a jar of XYZ. So I've got a full canning safety, and we're going to be going over that in a lot more detail and depth on the things that cannot be canned at home, even with a pressure canner, and why, in the class I'm doing on the 10th. And then we've got different resources on the website. The advantage, though, to pressure canned is having your food that is fully cooked and ready to serve. All you have to do is open the jar and it's completely shelf stable. So I love our pressure canner because honestly, when we are in the busy season or when I had my neck surgery last year and was really sick, I could just go to the shelves or send the kids there or whatnot, and there was food that was ready to go that we could just open, heat, and serve. So it has been wonderful that way. And of course, during power outages, I don't have to worry about water for reconstitution or anything like that. Heating, we heat a lot of our food on the wood stove when the power is out, but you could also just open the jars and away you go. Okay, now next up, I have fermentation. And fermentation is one of those really easy entry points to get into. You don't have to have a ton of supplies. And it's a long historical practice form of food preservation. It also enhances the health benefits of the food, where other methods can degrade it, or when you cook food, etc., you lose some of the nutrients. Some of them are increased, as in the case with tomatoes, but overall, fermentation is going to be one of the best ways to retain health benefits and also increase some of them. So fermenting foods uses a culture of good bacteria to preserve your food, and it contains the health benefits as well as preserving it. So this is going to be fermented vegetables, thinking things like sauerkraut or curtido, which is my favorite Spanish version of sauerkraut, fermented or saltwater brine, pickles, kimchi. Those are kind of a lot of the traditional methods or traditional food types that people think of when they think of fermentation. So it just uses salt and water or saltwater brine. So if it's a wet ferment, then it uses salt, a certain amount of salt with water, and you're creating a saltwater brine. Or you have what's called a dry ferment. This is typically what you see with your kimchis and your sauerkrauts, where you are salting the vegetable, letting the salt draw out the water from the vegetable. That creates its brine. So they're technically both wet, but it's the difference of you using a saltwater brine that you've created with water and salt versus just the vegetable and salt and it pulling out the juices from that. After your food has been fermented at room temperature, it does need to be kept in a cooler environment to slow the fermentation process down and for that long-term food storage. So this could be a refrigerator, which is typically what we use. Historically, it was a root cellar, buried things in the ground. If you have a cooler room, ideally what you're looking for is a temperature 55 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. Really, the 40s is better, or high 30s to really halt and be closer to the temperature of a refrigerator. But that is what's going to allow you to keep that fermented item once it is fermented for that longer period of time. But it doesn't require a ton of equipment, so that makes it very accessible and really easy route to go. Now, this one is also pretty easy, and this is where we have an immersion in alcohol. A lot of foods can be immersed in alcohol to preserve them. Alcohol has been used as a perversion, not a perversion. Oh my gosh, I did just say that. Alcohol has been used as a preservation method for a very long time historically. That's why we see have fruitcakes, right? That have been fruit soaked in alcohol, etc. So herbs and fruit tend to be the things that we use alcohol in. A lot of times it's extracts, sometimes it's soaking the fruit in them, herbal extracts, etc. I do my own homemade, I do a ton of tinctures, which is not really, extracts and tinctures aren't that much different, except tinctures are usually used as a medicinal, and extracts are usually more as a flavoring agent. but the method is pretty much the same. So for extract flavor, culinary wise, we do mint, vanilla, and lemon. Super easy to make those as extracts. I've got tutorials for you. You can go and see those. But then we also do a lot of my herbal tinctures for medicinal use, such as like echinacea. I do a ton of tinctures, but echinacea flower tincture is a really easy one to get going. And I've got videos as well as a blog post tutorial if you want to check out how to do those. So up next on our list is salt curing. So, and I kind of have salt curing meat and salt curing herbs as two separate. I mean, technically you're still using salt, but a little bit more complexity, right? Salt curing meat is, I don't know, harder is the right word, has more potential for danger if not done right because of botulism and spoiling versus salt curing herbs. So salt curing herbs definitely is going to be super easy. You can dehydrate a lot of your herbs, but I found that dehydrating herbs, especially things like basil, doesn't really retain the flavor of basil. Dehydrated basil is kind of like, where like fresh basil, you're like, whoo, like it's a flavor punch. So I actually only will eat, now I will freeze dry because that does retain the flavor. But if you don't have a freeze dryer, using the salt to make salted basil as your form of food preservation works amazing. You can do the same thing with celery leaves, really any of the green leafy herbs work really well. So once you know how to make your own herbal salt, especially basil, you'll probably never dehydrate basil again. I know I haven't. It tastes fresh and it keeps for months all the way in winter and into the next spring with still like that fresh, pungent mouth taste explosion that basil's known for. Again, I have a tutorial on how to do that rather than go into each one of it here. It's very basic steps. It's super easy to do. You're going to add salt and fresh herbs into a food processor and you just pulse until combined and then store. It's pretty amazing. Now, salt curing meat. Before refrigeration and the invention of the mason jar, which was in 1858, salt was the predominant way that was used to cure meat so it wouldn't spoil. Salt draws the moisture out of food. The absence of moisture makes it much harder for bacteria and spoilage to happen. So this is excellent for pork, salted fish, but you can do it with beef as well. The drawback is the meat still needs to be kept relatively cool. So having proper storage set up for it, depending on what method you're using, right? Salt cured ham. Some can be at room temperature. Some is still kept in a refrigerator environment. So for more tips on salt curing meat specifically that doesn't require refrigeration, then you're going to want to listen to the podcast that I did with Brandon Sheard from the Farmstead Meatsmith, and we'll have the link in the show notes as well as the blog post, but go and check that one out because it's pretty cool. Okay. Now on our list, I saved this one for last, not because it's hard. It's actually one of the easiest ones to do if I was going to be ranking it by that, but because you do have to have a freeze dryer in order to freeze dry. And it's it is the most expensive form of equipment when it comes to food preservation, but it is pretty awesome. So it's becoming more affordable depending on what size of unit you get. And as time goes on, some of those have came down in price, but yes, it is an investment. So I will preface with that. However, I didn't realize how many things I would make with my freeze dryer. It really opens up a whole new option of things that can be preserved in a shelf-stable manner that weren't safe to use any of the other forms before. So things like raw eggs, raw milk, your leftovers, like those are things that really didn't dehydrate well or had some safety concerns with dehydrating. Raw meat, I mean, so many things. Raw eggs is probably my favorite thing to freeze dry because I can then reconstitute that and use that in baking or making scrambled eggs, and it tastes just like fresh, which has been incredible. My own hot chocolate mix. I mean, so many options you can do with a freeze dryer. It retains the flavor of the herbs. It retains the nutritional value. The texture, of course, is different than dehydrated. So instead of chewy, it's crispy. We really like it. I will tell you though, with the freeze dryer, that the only thing that I have not preferred freeze dried has been cherries. Now the freeze dried cherries were delightful. They were just fine, but I love dehydrated cherries. Like as good as chocolate love dehydrated cherries. So I still dehydrate my cherries and I don't freeze dry them. But other than that, like freeze dried apples, freeze dried pears, plums, peaches, blackberries, raspberries, blueberries, love all of those in their freeze dried format more than dehydrated. So I freeze dry a ton of those. The vegetables, as I said, you really can't aside from pickling, things like cabbage and zucchini and cauliflower. So I freeze dried all of our excess of those last year, and they have been great for cooking and using, and freeze dried peppers. Oh, I love freeze dried peppers. They're like little crouton flavors on top of salads. So I really do like my freeze dryer, if you can't tell. And it's very easy as far as putting the food on the trays, sliding them into the machine and pushing the button, and it's doing all of the work, like pretty much hands off, aside from the prepping and putting it in the machine. And then I'll come back to that in a day or two, depending on what it is you're freeze drying. It still has about the same time as it would be dehydrating. You're not saving time in that area. Freeze drying is not faster than dehydrating, but because it's not the hands-on, and I'm not having to turn trays or that type of thing like I do with my dehydrator, I do really like the freeze dryer. So the cons would be expense. It does use power, but not as much as people seem to think. I have not noticed a huge increase in our electricity bill at all. A slight when using it. It does use power, but it's not been like this huge bump. And then a space of the actual freeze dryer. It's pretty big and it's heavy. So it's not something that you can easily move around, that type of thing. But it allows me to preserve items that I would not have been able to preserve at home. And of shelf-stable items, it has the longest shelf life, up to 25 years, depending on what it is you're freeze drying. If it's things that have some fat in it, like different cuts of meat, or things that have oils in it, etc., you're not going to get that 25-year shelf life. But on fruits and vegetables, those types of things, has a very long shelf life, and retains the most of the nutrients in comparison to any of our other forms of food preservation, which is pretty cool. So that is that is the main ways that you can preserve food at home. Very kind of high level. This is more just like an awareness of all the different ways that you can preserve food. So as far as exact equipment, more on the mode and safety of each of these methods, I'm going to be doing that free class, which is going to be again on June 10th. Would love to have you join me. You can go to melissaknorris.com/stockpile, and that will take you to the registration page to get signed up for the free class. I cannot wait to see you there. And speaking of resources, today's podcast episode is sponsored by Azure Standard. Azure Standard is one of my favorite resources for getting my supplies to sometimes preserve. If it's something that we're not growing ourselves here, I will get that in bulk from them. And my preserving supplies. So Azure has canning lids. They've got canning jars. They have canning salt. I actually use Redmond's real salt, which they carry. And I use that for my fermenting and my canning salt. It's my everything salt. It's all we use here for baking, cooking, canning, preserving, you name it. They have also got vinegar when it comes to your pickling needs. They have got organic vinegar, which is really hard for me to find locally, but white vinegar specifically, if I'm using that for pickling, I only want to use from an organic source. So they have got all of your needs there for preserving. And if you are a first-time customer of a $50 or more order, use coupon code Melissa10 and you will get 10% off your order as a first-time customer. So we are now moving into our verse of the week. And I have been in the book of Daniel we're doing Daniel in my Bible study. And we are specifically in Daniel chapter 9. And Daniel chapter 9, for those of you who are familiar with the Bible, you're probably familiar with the story. So I'll just give a little bit of preface and then I'll actually read the verse. But this is where Daniel is praying to the Lord. And it is very much an intercessory prayer for the nation of Israel. So during the book of Daniel, the nation of Israel is not in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem was captured. Daniel and a lot of the Hebrews there were taken to Babylon. And that's where, Daniel in the lion's den, when they, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego got thrown into the fire. Like all of this happens in Babylon, and is during Daniel's period. So Daniel, of course, is a prophet, and he is praying a very heavy intercessory prayer for the nation of Israel to God. And as far as intercessory prayer goes, I mean, if you just start in the first part of Daniel, the chapter of Daniel 9, verse 3, really, all the way through 19 is a beautiful and really heart-wrenching intercessory prayer of Daniel, very reminiscent to Moses, when Moses was praying to God to not smite all of the Israelites. We really see that kind of mimicked as Daniel is also going before the Lord and praying and asking God to forgive the Israelites. It very powerful as far as intercessory prayer goes, and kind of a model prayer there. But then once he gets finished with this intercessory prayer, we see where the Lord sends Gabriel, angel Gabriel, to Daniel. And at verse 23, so Daniel 9:23 says, this is Gabriel speaking to Daniel. At the beginning of your prayers, the word giving an answer went forth, and I have come to tell you, for you are greatly beloved. Therefore, consider the matter and understand the vision. Now, what's really fascinating about this is Gabriel was actually detained on his way to deliver the answer of prayer to Daniel. So it's as soon as Daniel started to pray, his prayer immediately went to heaven and was heard. So the moment that we pray, even though we might not see the immediate answer right then, God has immediately heard our prayer. And in this case, he had sent at once the answer to that prayer. However, Gabriel got held up in a battle, and it took him quite a while to break through to be able to get to Daniel and to answer that. And so that part is really interesting, because so often we're like, well, why didn't, and excuse me, let me back that train up just a minute. Is actually in chapter 10, where we get to the part where Gabriel is telling him that he was in the battle and it took him that long to get through to answer Daniel's prayer. But we start to see the beginning of that in chapter 9. So for those of you who are reading Daniel, like, hold on, that was actually in chapter 10. You're right. I'm prefacing up to that, where we see this first part in chapter 9. As much as I would love to read you all of chapter 9 and 10, it would actually be quite a while, because those are quite a few verses to read. But the reason that it struck me so much was the intercessory part and how important intercessory prayer is. And so intercessory prayer is when you are praying for someone other than yourself, really, like you are interceding on behalf of that person, on behalf of that situation, and you are taking that to prayer to God. And so intercessory prayer is very powerful and also very important. And it's showing us, as we read through this, that intercessory prayer, that is prayer that is heard. And when we pray intercessory prayers and God answers those, like, it creates a movement. I mean, it creates change in those situations, but sometimes we don't see that change or that going on behind the scenes in the spiritual world right away. So a lot of times it can feel like, I know myself, when I have been in intercessory prayer, sometimes it feels like you are praying and things aren't happening. You're not seeing the answer to prayer. But that's just because we aren't seeing it in the moment. It doesn't mean that change and that things aren't being moved and things aren't happening based upon those prayers. We just always can't see them. And so it's almost more important that we continue that prayer until we're able to see the answer, because sometimes those things are held up. And even though the word immediately went out from God, we didn't actually get to see that breakthrough until days later. In the instance of this particular story, I think it was 21 days, if I remember correctly. But, sometimes in other situations, I know there's been areas where I have prayed intercessory prayers on something, and sometimes it's been years before I actually saw the change. And that can be kind of disheartening, right? It can be really hard. But if you're in that spot, just know to not give up and to continue praying, because our prayers do make a difference and our prayers do change things both here and in the spiritual realm. And also, what a beautiful thing that as soon as we pray, that prayer immediately goes into God's hearing and into God's kingdom, and into the throne room. That's pretty powerful all on its own, just to really sit and to think about that. The moment that we utter those prayers have entered into God's presence. So I hope you find that encouraging as I did. And I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And I will be back here with you next week. So blessings and mason jars for now, my friend.